Have you ever felt like you disappeared into someone else's emotional world so completely that you forgot who you were? Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling drained, confused, carrying feelings that weren't even yours to begin with? Carl Jung discovered a psychological phenomenon so dangerous that he warned it could completely dissolve your sense of self. He called it participation mystique, and if you're someone who feels deeply, your psychological survival depends on understanding it. Jung wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was describing an actual psychological state, where the boundaries between you and another person dissolve so completely that you lose the ability to distinguish your emotions from theirs, your thoughts from theirs, your identity from theirs. This isn't sensitivity. This isn't empathy. This is something far more primitive and far more perilous. Jung adopted this term from French anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, who observed this phenomenon in what he called primitive cultures. But Jung recognized something profound. This wasn't limited to ancient peoples. It was happening in his consulting room, in modern relationships, in the very heart of civilized society. And nowhere is it more prevalent or more dangerous than in those Jung identified as having what he called the feeling function as their dominant psychological type. Today, we're going to explore Jung's most underestimated concept, how participation mystique explains why empaths lose themselves, Jung's law of enantiodromia that transforms psychological victims into sovereign beings, and the individuation process that creates true psychological immunity. Because Jung understood something that modern psychology is only beginning to grasp. The very sensitivity that makes you capable of profound connection is the same sensitivity that makes you vulnerable to complete psychological dissolution. But he also discovered the path out, the transformation that turns your greatest vulnerability into your most dangerous strength. To understand what's happening to you as an empath, we need to go directly to Jung's own words. Because what he discovered about participation mystique will fundamentally change how you see every relationship in your life. Jung defined participation mystique as, quote, a peculiar kind of psychological connection with objects, and consists in the fact that the subject cannot clearly distinguish himself from the object, but is bound to it by a direct relationship, which amounts to partial identity. This identity results from an a priori oneness of subject and object. End quote. Let me translate this from Jung's academic language into something that will hit you in the gut. Participation mystique is when you become so psychologically entangled with another person that you literally cannot tell where you end and they begin. Your emotions become their emotions. Their pain becomes your pain. Their anxiety becomes your anxiety. Not because you're choosing to empathize, but because the boundaries of your psyche have dissolved. You think you're in a relationship, but Jung understood something chilling. Quote, most connections in the world are not relationships. They are participation mystique. One is then apparently connected, but of course, it is never a real connection. It is never a relationship. But it gives the feeling of being one sheep in the flock, at least. Think about that. Most of what we call relationships aren't actually relationships at all. They're unconscious psychological fusions, where two people lose themselves in each other. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. People with a narrow conscious life exteriorize their unconscious. They are continually in participation mystique with other people. And here's what makes empaths particularly vulnerable. Jung identified people like you as having what he called the feeling function, as your dominant psychological type. He wrote, the man with the empathic attitude finds himself in a world that needs his subjective feeling to give it life and soul. He animates it with himself. Do you see what's happening? You don't just feel others' emotions. You literally animate the world around you with your own psychic energy. You give life to what is lifeless, soul to what is soulless. But in doing so, you become depleted, confused, lost. This is why you walk away from certain people feeling like something essential has been drained from you. This is why you can spend hours trying to help someone, and feel more exhausted than if you'd run a marathon. This is why you sometimes look in the mirror and don't recognize the person staring back. You're not in relationship with them. You're in participation mystique. And Jung understood that this seemingly loving connection is actually one of the most dangerous psychological states a human being can experience. Because when you lose the ability to distinguish yourself from others, you lose the capacity for genuine choice, authentic emotion, and individual consciousness. You become what Jung called one sheep in the flock, moving, feeling, thinking not from your own center, but from the collective unconscious pull of everyone around you. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing about this state. It makes you vulnerable to what he called 30 days, psychic infection. Jung didn't just observe participation mystique as an abstract psychological phenomenon. He lived it. He experienced it in his consulting room with patients. And what he discovered was so unsettling that he issued a direct warning about what he called psychic infection. Jung wrote, "In this broad belt of unconsciousness, which is immune to conscious criticism and control, we stand defenseless, open to all kinds of influences and psychic infections." Psychic infection. Jung used this term deliberately. Like a biological infection, psychological contents can transmit from one person to another. And just like a biological infection, the person with the weakest immune system, the most open boundaries, is most susceptible. Jung learned this the hard way in his therapeutic work. He warned fellow therapists that the treatment not only demands uncommon efforts, but may also induce psychic infections in a therapist who himself has a rather unstable disposition. Think about what Jung was saying here. Even trained psychologists, people who understood the human psyche professionally, were at risk of becoming infected by their patients' psychological contents. How much more vulnerable are you, walking through daily life with your empathic nature wide open? Here's how psychic infection works, according to Jung's observations. When you're in participation mystique with someone, you're not just feeling their emotions. You're unconsciously absorbing their psychological complexes, their unresolved traumas, their rejected shadow material. That person who always calls you in crisis. You're not just listening to their problems. You're taking their psychological chaos into your own psyche and trying to process it as if it were your own. That family member who seems incapable of taking responsibility, their unowned guilt, shame, and rage doesn't just disappear. It gets projected onto you, and in your participation mystique state, you absorb it as your own burden. That friend who drains you with their constant negativity. They're not just sharing their pessimism. They're unconsciously using you as a repository for all the darkness they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. Jung understood that when someone refuses to face their own shadow, their own pain, fear, anger, inadequacy, that shadow doesn't vanish. It seeks a host. And empaths, with their open boundaries and unconscious willingness to carry others' pain, become the perfect carriers. You become what Jung might have called a shadow repository, unconsciously holding and processing the rejected psychological material of everyone in your orbit. This is why you sometimes feel overwhelmed by emotions that seem to come from nowhere. This is why you can wake up anxious or depressed without any clear reason. This is why you might find yourself thinking thoughts or feeling impulses that don't seem like you. They're not you. They're the psychological contents you've absorbed through participation mystique. But here's what makes this truly dangerous. When you're carrying others' unprocessed shadow material, you lose touch with your own authentic feelings, your own needs, your own psychological center. Jung observed that the more unconscious a person remains about these dynamics, the more susceptible they become. If more unconscious things have become conscious to you, then you live less in participation mystique. In other words, awareness is your only protection. Consciousness is your only immunity. But most empaths never reach this awareness because they mistake participation mystique for love, psychic infection for compassion, and shadow carrying for spiritual service. And so they remain trapped in what Jung understood to be a fundamentally unhealthy psychological state, slowly losing themselves in service to others' unconsciousness, until something breaks. Jung called this breaking point enantiodromia, the moment when everything reverses into its opposite. What happens when an empath who has spent years, maybe decades, lost in participation mystique, finally reaches their limit? Jung had a term for this moment, and it comes from ancient Greek philosophy. Enantiodromia, literally meaning running counter to, or running in the opposite direction. Jung defined it precisely. Enantiodromia, referring to the emergence of the unconscious opposite in the course of time. This characteristic phenomenon practically always occurs when an extreme, one-sided tendency dominates conscious life. In time, an equally powerful counterposition is built up, which first inhibits the conscious performance and subsequently breaks through the conscious control. Let me show you what this looks like in real life. Meet Sarah. For 32 years, Sarah had been the family emotional caretaker, the friend everyone called during their 3 a.m. breakdown, the colleague who stayed late to help others meet their deadlines, while her own projects suffered in silence. Sarah was living in pure participation mystique. She had no boundaries between her emotional world and everyone else's. She absorbed her mother's anxiety, her sister's relationship drama, her co-workers' stress, her friends' depression. She had become what Jung would call a psychological sponge, soaking up everyone's unprocessed emotions and trying to transform them through her own system. For years, this pattern held. Sarah's conscious identity was built around being helpful, understanding, endlessly available. She told herself this was love. She told herself this was spiritual. She told herself this was who she was. But Jung understood something crucial. The psyche will not remain split forever. When conscious life becomes too one-sided, the unconscious begins building an equally powerful opposite force. Sarah's breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Her sister called, upset about the same relationship pattern they'd discussed hundreds of times before. The same toxic dynamic, the same excuses, the same request for Sarah to absorb the emotional chaos and transform it into wisdom. And for the first time in her life, Sarah felt nothing. Not anger. She had moved beyond anger years ago. Not frustration. Frustration required the belief that things could change. Not even compassion. That well had finally run dry. Just a profound, crystalline clarity that seemed to come from the deepest part of her being. I'm done. This is enantiodromia in action. Jung understood that when any psychological position becomes too extreme, the psyche automatically generates its opposite. The ultimate giver becomes absolutely self-protective. The endless helper becomes completely unavailable. The chronic people-pleaser becomes immovably sovereign. Jung had observed this pattern throughout history. He cited examples like St. Paul, who went from persecuting Christians to becoming one of Christianity's most important advocates, or Friedrich Nietzsche, who initially revered Wagner's music and later came to despise it. The pattern is always the same. An extreme position held too long generates its unconscious opposite, which eventually erupts into consciousness with tremendous force. For Sarah, and for empaths like her, this moment feels like death and rebirth simultaneously. The person she thought she was, endlessly giving, constantly available, perpetually understanding, that person dissolves. And from that dissolution emerges someone she barely recognizes. Someone who can say no without guilt. Someone who can witness others' pain without absorbing it. Someone who can choose when and how to engage, rather than being compulsively driven by others' needs. Jung wrote, enantiodromia is typically experienced in conjunction with symptoms associated with acute neurosis, and often foreshadows a rebirth of the personality. This is why the moment of empath awakening can feel so disorienting, so frightening. You're not just changing your behavior, you're experiencing a fundamental reorganization of your psychological structure. The shadow that you've been afraid of, your capacity for selfishness, for boundaries, for saying no, for putting yourself first, suddenly becomes available to consciousness. And what you discover is that this isn't your dark side. It's your missing side. The side you exiled in order to be loved, to be needed, to be safe. But Jung also issued a warning about this process. He said, The only person who escapes the grim law of enantiodromia is the man who knows how to separate himself from the unconscious. Not by repressing it, for then it simply attacks him from the rear, but by putting it clearly before him as that which he is not. In other words, the goal isn't to swing from one extreme to the other. The goal is consciousness. Integration, what Jung called individuation. What Sarah experienced was not the end of her journey. It was the beginning of what Jung considered the most important psychological process a human being can undertake: individuation. Jung understood individuation as the path to becoming psychologically whole. Not perfect, not healed in some simplistic sense, but whole. Conscious of both your light and your shadow, capable of both connection and separation, able to choose your responses rather than being unconsciously driven by psychological complexes. For empaths, individuation requires a fundamental shift in how they relate to their own sensitivity. Jung wrote, "If more unconscious things have become conscious to you, then you live less in participation mystique." This is the key insight. The antidote to participation mystique isn't becoming less sensitive. It's becoming more conscious. Let me show you what this looks like. After Sarah's moment of enantiodromia, she began what Jung would call shadow work. She started paying attention to all the parts of herself she had rejected in order to be the good person, the helpful person, the understanding person. Her capacity for anger, her need for recognition, her desire to be cared for rather than always doing the caring. Her ability to judge, to discriminate, to say, "This person is not good for me," without trying to fix them. These weren't character flaws to be eliminated. In Jung's understanding, they were essential aspects of her psyche that had been split off and needed to be consciously integrated. Jung called this the integration of the shadow. For empaths, the shadow often contains precisely the qualities they most need: discernment, healthy selfishness, the ability to protect their own energy, the capacity to let others face their own consequences. This is where most people misunderstand the process. They think shadow integration means becoming cruel or selfish. But Jung understood something more subtle. When you consciously integrate your shadow, you don't become its opposite. You become whole. You gain access to the full spectrum of human psychological capacities. Sarah didn't stop caring about others. She stopped caring about others more than she cared about herself. She didn't lose her empathy. She learned to deploy it consciously rather than unconsciously. This is what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold opposites in consciousness without being torn apart by them, to be both compassionate and boundaried, both open and protected, both generous and discriminating. Jung observed that most people live their entire lives split between opposites, swinging from one extreme to the other. But the individuated person, the psychologically mature person, learns to stand at the center, conscious of both poles, able to choose which aspect to express based on the situation, rather than being compulsively driven by unconscious patterns. For empaths, this is revolutionary. Instead of being at the mercy of everyone else's emotional states, you become what Jung would call sovereign. You can feel others' emotions without being overwhelmed by them. You can offer support without depleting yourself. You can love without losing yourself. But here's what makes this process so challenging. It requires you to give up the identity that has defined you for so long. The identity of the rescuer, the helper, the one who puts everyone else first. Jung understood that these identities, what he called the persona, are often trauma responses disguised as virtues. The empath who can't say no learned early that their worth depended on their usefulness. The person who absorbs everyone's pain learned that their emotional labor was the price of love. Individuation requires grieving these patterns while reclaiming the authentic self that exists beneath them. Sarah had to face the painful truth that much of what she called love was actually fear. Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of being seen as selfish or uncaring. Her endless giving wasn't coming from a place of fullness. It was coming from a place of desperate need for approval and acceptance. This recognition was devastating. But Jung understood that such devastation is often necessary for psychological rebirth. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, he wrote. Sarah's irritation with others' neediness led her to recognize her own unmet needs. Her exhaustion with others' emotional chaos led her to acknowledge her own unprocessed emotions. Her resentment of others' selfishness led her to embrace her own healthy self-interest. This is the alchemical process Jung wrote about extensively. The transformation of psychological lead into gold. The conscious integration of what has been unconsciously rejected. And what emerges from this process is something Jung understood to be far more powerful than the original empath. The person who can access their sensitivity as a choice rather than a compulsion. Who can love from fullness rather than emptiness. Who can give without giving themselves away. This is when the empath becomes truly dangerous, not to others, but to the systems that depend on their unconsciousness. The relationships that feed on their depletion, the dynamics that require their self-abandonment to function. Because the conscious empath can no longer be manipulated, exploited, or drained. They have learned what Jung called the most important psychological skill, the ability to separate themselves from the unconscious without repressing it. They can feel everything and choose what to do with those feelings. They can see others clearly without taking responsibility for what they see. They can love without merging, care without carrying, help without sacrificing themselves on the altar of others' unconsciousness. This is individuation. This is psychological sovereignty. This is what Jung understood to be the birthright of every human being, if they have the courage to reclaim it. The person who emerges from Jung's individuation process is fundamentally different from both the original unconscious empath and the stereotypical selfish person. They represent what Jung considered the highest achievement of human consciousness, the integration of opposites. Jung had a vision of human psychological development that went far beyond mere symptom relief or behavioral change. He saw the possibility of human beings becoming conscious participants in their own psychological lives, rather than unconscious victims of psychological forces. For the individuated empath, this means developing what we might call conscious empathy, the ability to attune to others' emotional states without losing yourself in them, to feel with others without feeling for them, to understand without absorbing. This isn't coldness, it's precision. It's the difference between being a sponge that absorbs everything indiscriminately and being a skilled physician who can diagnose illness without catching it. Sarah, 3 years into her individuation journey, described the change this way. I can still feel everything I used to feel, but now it's like I'm watching it through glass. I can see their pain, I can understand their struggle, I can even feel moved by their experience. But it doesn't become mine. I don't take it home. I don't carry it in my body. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the importance of consciousness in human psychological development. The conscious person doesn't stop feeling. They start choosing what to do with their feelings. They develop what Jung would call discernment, the ability to distinguish between their own psychological material and others, between what belongs to them and what doesn't, between what they can actually help and what they need to allow others to face on their own. This discernment becomes their psychological immune system. Just as your physical immune system protects you from biological threats without shutting down your ability to interact with the world, psychological discernment protects you from psychic infection without shutting down your capacity for genuine connection. But perhaps most importantly, the conscious empath becomes immune to a particular form of manipulation that Jung observed repeatedly in his clinical work, the manipulation that preys on empathy itself. Jung understood that unconscious people often target conscious empaths precisely because of their sensitivity. They unconsciously seek out those who will absorb their projected pain, carry their rejected shadow material, enable their unconscious patterns. The conscious empath can recognize these dynamics immediately, not with judgment, but with clarity. They can see when someone is seeking a psychological host for their unprocessed material. They can feel when someone is trying to use empathy as a form of emotional labor extraction. And they can respond consciously rather than reactively. They can offer appropriate support without taking on inappropriate responsibility. They can maintain compassion without enabling unconsciousness. This is what makes them dangerous to toxic systems, not because they attack or retaliate, but because they can no longer be used. They have become, in Jung's terms, psychologically unavailable for unconscious projections and manipulations. They've learned to recognize the difference between genuine connection and participation mystique, between authentic love and psychological fusion, between healthy empathy and codependent enmeshment. This recognition changes everything. Relationships that were based on unconscious dynamics either evolve or end. People who were dependent on the empath's unconscious enabling either grow or disappear. Systems that required the empath's self-sacrifice either adapt or collapse. Jung believed that such individuals become agents of consciousness in the world, not through preaching or teaching, but simply through being, through modeling what conscious relationship looks like, through demonstrating that it's possible to be deeply sensitive and strongly boundaried simultaneously. They become what Jung called carriers of consciousness, people whose very presence invites others toward greater awareness, not through force or manipulation, but through the natural magnetism of psychological wholeness. This is the empath's true calling, according to Jung's understanding, not to absorb the world's pain, but to transform it through consciousness, not to carry others' shadows, but to inspire them to face their own, not to enable unconsciousness, but to midwife the birth of awareness. As we reach the end of this exploration into Jung's understanding of the empath's journey, I want to leave you with perhaps his most profound insight about the nature of psychological transformation. Jung wrote, "The grand plan on which the unconscious life of the psyche is constructed is so inaccessible to our understanding that we can never know what evil may not be necessary in order to produce good by enantiodromia, and what good may very possibly lead to evil." Think about what Jung is saying here. Your years of unconscious empathy, the participation mystique, the psychic infections, the endless self-sacrifice. Jung understood that even this suffering serves a purpose in the larger pattern of psychological development. It was necessary for you to lose yourself completely in order to discover what it means to find yourself consciously. You had to experience the extreme of selflessness to access the power of healthy self-interest. You had to live in participation mystique to appreciate the gift of psychological sovereignty. This is the paradox Jung recognized throughout his work. Our greatest wounds often become our greatest wisdom. Our deepest unconsciousness often births our most profound awareness. Our most painful patterns often contain the seeds of our liberation. For empaths, this means that everything you've experienced, every time you've been drained, every relationship that depleted you, every moment you felt lost in someone else's emotional chaos, all of it has been preparing you for this moment of conscious choice. The choice to step out of participation mystique and into genuine relationship. The choice to transform psychic infection into conscious discernment. The choice to evolve from unconscious empathy to conscious love. Jung believed that consciousness was humanity's greatest achievement. Not intelligence, not creativity, not even love, but consciousness. The ability to be aware of our own psychological processes as they're happening. This is what separates the conscious empath from the unconscious one. Not the capacity to feel, but the awareness of feeling. Not the ability to connect, but the choice of when and how to connect. Not the power to absorb others' emotions, but the wisdom to recognize which emotions belong to whom. Jung also understood that this journey toward consciousness is never complete. Individuation isn't a destination you reach once and remain at forever. It's an ongoing process of becoming more awake, more aware, more consciously responsive to life's complexities. There will be moments when you slip back into old patterns, times when you find yourself absorbing someone else's anxiety or taking responsibility for emotions that aren't yours. Jung would say this is natural, even necessary. The spiral of consciousness moves us forward, but it also circles back to familiar territories at deeper levels. The difference is that now you have awareness, Now you have choice. Now you can recognize participation mystique when it's happening and consciously extricate yourself. You can feel the pull of others' unconsciousness without being drawn into it. You can maintain your center even in the midst of emotional chaos. This is what Jung meant when he spoke about the transcendent function. Not transcending your humanity, but transcending the unconscious compulsions that have driven your behavior. Not rising above your emotions, but learning to dance with them consciously. Jung's final insight about empaths might surprise you. He believed that those who had the capacity for deep feeling, those who could access what he called the feeling function most readily, had a unique role to play in the evolution of human consciousness. Not as martyrs who sacrificed themselves for others' unconsciousness, not as repositories for the world's unprocessed pain, but as pioneers who demonstrate what conscious relationship looks like, as bridges between the unconscious and conscious realms, as living examples that it's possible to feel deeply and think clearly, to love fully and maintain boundaries, to serve others and honor yourself. In Jung's vision, the conscious empath becomes a force for psychological evolution, not through what they do, but through who they are, through their very existence as proof that consciousness and compassion can coexist. That sensitivity and strength are not opposites, but partners in the dance of human becoming. The path from participation mystique to individuation is not easy. Jung never promised it would be, but he understood it to be the most meaningful journey a human being can undertake. The journey from unconsciousness to consciousness, from psychological slavery to psychological freedom, from being lived by unconscious forces to living consciously. Your sensitivity was never your weakness. Your empathy was never your curse. They were always your doorway to the deepest truths about human nature, relationship, and the possibility of conscious love. Jung knew what you're only beginning to discover, that the person who can feel everything and remain centered, who can love everyone and lose no one, especially themselves, becomes a healing presence in a world desperate for conscious connection. This is your true calling, not to absorb the world's pain, but to transform it through awareness. Not to carry other shadows, but to inspire them to face their own. Not to disappear into relationships, but to bring consciousness to them. This is Jung's gift to empaths everywhere. The understanding that your journey through unconsciousness was not a mistake, but a preparation. That your capacity for feeling is not a burden, but a responsibility. That your path to consciousness is not just personal healing, but a contribution to the healing of the world. There is something Carl Jung discovered about highly sensitive people that changed everything he thought he knew about human psychology. In his private correspondence with his colleague Tony Wolff, Jung wrote about a specific psychological capacity he observed in what we now call highly sensitive persons. He called it the transcendent function, and he believed it represented the next stage of human psychological evolution. But here's what Jung realized that most people still don't understand. This capacity doesn't make highly sensitive people weak or overwhelmed. When properly developed, it makes them psychologically stronger than those who live only on the surface of consciousness. Jung discovered that roughly 15 to 20% of any population possesses nervous systems wired for what he termed deep processing. These individuals don't just think about experiences, they metabolize them. They don't just observe emotions, they integrate them into wisdom. Most psychology focuses on helping sensitive people cope with their intensity. Jung took the opposite approach. He asked, what if this intensity isn't a problem to be solved, but a capacity to be developed? In his exploration of psychological types, Jung identified that highly sensitive people possess what he called differentiated perception, the ability to detect subtleties in human behavior, emotional climates, and unconscious patterns that others completely miss. But Jung also discovered something troubling. Without proper psychological development, this gift becomes a burden. Sensitive people absorb the unconscious material of everyone around them, becoming what he described as psychic sponges, rather than conscious processors. This is why so many highly sensitive people feel exhausted, overwhelmed, or like they don't belong in this world. They're operating sophisticated psychological equipment without an instruction manual. Today, we're going to explore Jung's revolutionary framework for transforming sensitivity from survival mechanism into evolutionary advantage. Because Jung believed that highly sensitive people aren't just adapting to the world, they're preparing consciousness itself for its next developmental leap. The question isn't whether you're too sensitive for this world. The question Jung posed is far more profound. Is this world ready for the level of consciousness you're capable of developing? We'll examine 3 core discoveries Jung made about highly sensitive people, why he believed they hold the key to collective psychological evolution, and most importantly, his practical framework for developing what he called the container that allows sensitive people to transform their gift from burden into brilliance. To understand Jung's revolutionary perspective on highly sensitive people, we need to understand what he discovered about consciousness itself. Jung spent decades studying what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological substrate that connects all human minds. Through his analysis of dreams, myths, and psychological patterns across cultures, he realized that consciousness isn't static, it evolves. But here's what Jung observed that changed everything. This evolution doesn't happen uniformly across all people. Some individuals are born with nervous systems naturally attuned to deeper layers of psychological processing. These people, what Jung termed differentiated perceivers, serve as scouts for consciousness itself. In his 1921 work, Psychological Types, Jung wrote about individuals who process information through what he called introverted sensation and introverted feeling. These types don't just register surface experiences. They automatically scan for underlying patterns, emotional undercurrents, and systemic connections that others miss entirely. Jung realized this wasn't a personality preference. It was a neurological difference that served an evolutionary function. Think about it from nature's perspective. In any complex system, whether it's an ecosystem, a social group, or a species, you need early warning systems. You need individuals sensitive enough to detect subtle changes before they become obvious to everyone else. Jung observed that highly sensitive people serve this function for human consciousness. They feel the emotional climate of groups before conflict erupts. They sense when systems are becoming unstable. They detect inauthenticity and psychological disconnection that others rationalize away. But Jung also recognized a crucial paradox. The very sensitivity that makes these individuals valuable to collective consciousness often makes their personal lives extraordinarily difficult. In his correspondence with fellow analyst Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung described what he called the container problem. Highly sensitive people possess sophisticated psychological processing capabilities, but most lack what he termed a strong enough container to hold the intensity of what they perceive. Without this container, Jung observed, sensitive people become overwhelmed by their own gifts. They absorb the unconscious material of everyone around them without the psychological structure to process it consciously. They become what he described as wounded by their own sensitivity. This is where Jung's approach diverged radically from both the psychology of his time and much of today's mental health field. Rather than trying to reduce sensitivity or help people cope with it, Jung focused on building the container, developing the psychological strength and structure that allows sensitive people to transform their perceptions into wisdom. Jung believed this container development wasn't just personal healing, it was preparation for what he called the next stage of human psychological evolution. He theorized that as humanity faces increasingly complex challenges, environmental, social, technological, we need individuals capable of processing complexity without being overwhelmed by it. We need people who can feel deeply without drowning, who can perceive systemic problems before they become crises. Jung saw highly sensitive people as consciousness pioneers, developing capacities that humanity as a whole will eventually need. But this evolution requires conscious development. It demands what Jung called individuation, the process of integrating all aspects of the psyche into a coherent, resilient whole. Today, we're going to explore Jung's three-part framework for this development: building psychological structure, developing differentiated perception, and cultivating what he called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox and complexity without collapsing into overwhelm. Jung understood that highly sensitive people possess what he called permeable psychic boundaries. This isn't a flaw, it's a feature. But like any sophisticated instrument, it requires proper calibration. In his therapeutic work, Jung observed that many sensitive individuals live in what he termed psychological fusion with their environment. They experience others' emotions as their own, absorb the mood of rooms they enter, and feel personally responsible for psychological states that aren't theirs to carry. Jung's solution wasn't to make these people less sensitive. It was to help them develop what he called conscious containers, psychological structures strong enough to hold intensity without being overwhelmed by it. Think of it this way: a highly sensitive person's psyche is like a high-powered telescope. It can perceive incredible detail and subtlety that others miss. But without a stable mounting system, that same sensitivity creates nothing but blur and chaos. Jung identified three essential components of psychological structure that allow sensitive people to transform their gift from burden into brilliance. First, differentiated self-awareness. Jung discovered that many sensitive people suffer from what he called projective identification. They feel so much from their environment that they lose track of which emotions actually originate within them. In his case studies, Jung described patients who would enter therapy complaining of overwhelming sadness, only to discover through analysis that they were absorbing the grief of family members who never processed their own losses. Jung's technique involved what he called affect mapping, helping patients distinguish between their authentic emotional responses and the psychological material they'd absorbed from others. He would ask questions like, when did this feeling first appear? What was happening in your environment? Does this emotion feel familiar from your own life experiences? Or does it feel foreign, like something you're carrying for someone else? This isn't about becoming disconnected or emotionally distant. It's about developing what Jung called conscious empathy, the ability to feel with others without losing your own psychological center. Second, symbolic processing. Jung realized that highly sensitive people often become overwhelmed because they process everything literally rather than symbolically. They take on the raw emotional content of their environment without transforming it into insight. In his analytical psychology, Jung taught sensitive individuals to engage what he called the symbolic attitude, the capacity to see emotional experiences as information rather than instructions. For example, if you sense anxiety in a room, Jung would encourage you to ask, what is this anxiety telling me about the collective psychological state here? What information is this providing about underlying tensions or unresolved issues? Instead of absorbing the anxiety and making it your own, you transform it into data about human psychological patterns. You become an observer of consciousness rather than a victim of it. Jung believed this symbolic processing was crucial because it activates what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's natural capacity to transform raw experience into wisdom. Third, temporal boundaries. Perhaps Jung's most practical insight was about the relationship between sensitivity and time. He observed that sensitive people often experience what he called temporal fusion, past wounds, present experiences, and future anxieties collapsing into a single overwhelming moment. Jung developed what he called temporal differentiation techniques. He taught patients to consciously separate past psychological material from present moment experiences. When overwhelming feelings arise, Jung would guide people through a process. Is this feeling about something happening right now? Is it connected to something from your past that needs processing? Or is it anxiety about a future scenario that may never occur? This temporal awareness creates what Jung called psychological spaciousness, the ability to experience intensity without being consumed by it. Jung also emphasized the importance of what he termed integration periods, regular time spent in solitude, allowing the psyche to process absorbed material consciously rather than carrying it indefinitely. Jung understood that building psychological structure isn't about creating rigid barriers. It's about developing what he called conscious permeability, the ability to open and close your psychological receptivity based on choice rather than circumstance. A psychologically structured, sensitive person can enter a room full of emotional intensity, perceive what's happening at subtle levels, gather valuable information about human psychological patterns, and then consciously release what doesn't belong to them. They become what Jung called conscious mirrors, reflecting back to others their own psychological material without absorbing it permanently. This is the foundation of what Jung considered the sensitive person's evolutionary function, serving as early warning systems for collective psychological health while maintaining their own psychological integrity. But structure is only the first step. Once you've built the container, you need to develop what's inside it, the capacity for differentiated perception that makes your sensitivity a gift to consciousness itself. Once you've built the psychological container, Jung believed the next step was refining what he called differentiated perception, the ability to consciously direct your sensitivity rather than being overwhelmed by it. Jung observed that most highly sensitive people operate in what he termed global perception mode. They sense everything simultaneously: emotions, tensions, unspoken dynamics, but lack the psychological tools to organize this information meaningfully. It's like having a radio that picks up every frequency at once. You're receiving tremendous amounts of information, but without the ability to tune into specific stations, it's just noise. Jung's solution involved developing what he called perceptual discrimination, the conscious ability to focus your sensitivity on specific psychological patterns while filtering out others. In his analytical work, Jung noticed that sensitive people often become consumed by the emotional content of what they perceive, missing the underlying psychological patterns that could provide valuable insights. Jung taught patients to shift from asking, "What am I feeling?" to, "What pattern is this revealing?" For example, instead of absorbing someone's anxiety and making it your own, Jung would encourage you to observe. This person's anxiety follows a specific pattern. It intensifies when certain topics arise. It seems connected to their relationship with authority figures. This shift from emotional absorption to pattern recognition transforms sensitivity from a burden into a sophisticated analytical tool. Jung believed this capacity for pattern recognition was evolutionarily significant. In his view, highly sensitive people serve as early detection systems for psychological dysfunction in groups, families, and societies. Jung's most revolutionary insight was teaching sensitive people to perceive through what he called the archetypal lens, recognizing universal psychological patterns rather than getting lost in personal emotional content. When you encounter someone's anger, instead of absorbing their rage, you might recognize the archetype of the wounded warrior, someone whose aggression masks deeper vulnerability and unmet needs for recognition. When you sense depression in a room, instead of taking on that heaviness, you might perceive the archetype of the descent, a necessary psychological process where old identities dissolve to make space for new growth. This archetypal perspective doesn't diminish empathy. It actually enhances it by providing a framework for understanding human psychological experiences within larger patterns of meaning. Jung believed that sensitive people who develop archetypal perception become what he called psychological translators, able to help others understand their own unconscious processes by recognizing universal patterns within personal struggles. Perhaps Jung's most practical contribution was his understanding of attention as a conscious tool rather than a passive experience. Jung observed that highly sensitive people often suffer from what he called attention scatter. Their awareness gets pulled in multiple directions simultaneously, creating overwhelm and exhaustion. He developed techniques for what he termed conscious attention direction, the ability to deliberately focus your perceptual sensitivity on specific psychological phenomena while consciously ignoring others. Jung would teach patients to practice what he called selective psychological engagement. In a room full of people, you might consciously choose to focus only on group dynamics rather than individual emotional states. Or you might deliberately attune to creative energy while filtering out anxiety or conflict. This isn't about becoming less sensitive. It's about becoming strategically sensitive, using your perceptual gifts intentionally rather than being at their mercy. Jung recognized that developing differentiated perception creates what he called the integration challenge. As sensitive people become more conscious of psychological patterns, they face a crucial choice. How do you use this insight responsibly? Jung warned against what he called psychological voyeurism, using sensitivity to analyze others without their consent or for purposes of manipulation or superiority. He emphasized that differentiated perception should serve what he termed mutual individuation, using your insights to facilitate growth and understanding rather than to gain advantage or control. Jung believed that ethically developed sensitivity creates what he called psychological safety for others. People feel seen and understood rather than analyzed or judged. The culmination of differentiated perception, in Jung's view, was developing what he called the conscious observer, a part of the psyche that can witness psychological phenomena without being consumed by them. This observer can recognize that someone is projecting their unresolved father issues onto authority figures without taking that projection personally. It can perceive family dysfunction without absorbing the family's pain as its own burden. Jung saw this conscious observer as crucial for what he called the therapeutic function, the natural capacity that developed sensitive people have to create psychological healing simply through conscious presence. But Jung emphasized that this capacity only emerges through disciplined inner work. It requires what he called shadow integration, facing and accepting the parts of yourself that you've rejected or denied. Without shadow work, sensitivity becomes contaminated by your own unconscious material, making accurate perception impossible. Jung's most profound insight about highly sensitive people centered on what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's natural capacity to hold contradictory experiences without collapsing into overwhelm or fragmentation. For most people, psychological contradictions create crisis. When faced with opposing emotions, conflicting values, or paradoxical situations, the typical response is to choose one side and reject the other. Jung called this the either-or consciousness, a psychological limitation that keeps people trapped in simplistic thinking. But Jung observed that highly sensitive people, when properly developed, possess an extraordinary capacity for what he termed both and consciousness. They can hold complex psychological realities without needing to resolve them into false simplicity. Jung recognized that sensitivity itself is fundamentally paradoxical. Highly sensitive people are simultaneously strong and vulnerable, deeply empathetic, yet requiring significant boundaries, capable of profound insight, while often struggling with basic social interactions. Most therapeutic approaches try to resolve these paradoxes, to make sensitive people either more resilient or more protected, either more engaged or more boundaried. Jung took a radically different approach. He believed that the goal wasn't to resolve the paradox, but to develop what he called paradox tolerance, the ability to consciously hold opposing truths without psychological fragmentation. In his therapeutic work, Jung would help sensitive patients recognize that their contradictory experiences weren't signs of psychological illness, but indicators of psychological complexity. The capacity to feel both deep compassion and appropriate anger, both openness and discernment, both vulnerability and strength. This wasn't confusion, it was sophistication. Jung called this psychological amplitude, the ability to access the full spectrum of human experience without getting trapped in any single emotional state. Jung's transcendent function operates through what he described as conscious opposition holding. Instead of trying to eliminate psychological tensions, you learn to maintain awareness of both sides simultaneously until a third option emerges. For example, imagine you're highly sensitive and facing a demanding relationship. Part of you feels compassionate obligation to help. Another part feels resentful and wants to withdraw. Traditional thinking would force you to choose, either be compassionate or protect yourself. Jung's transcendent function allows you to hold both truths consciously until a more sophisticated response emerges, perhaps compassionate boundary setting that serves both your well-being and the relationship's health. This isn't compromise, which Jung saw as a reduction of both sides. It's what he called creative synthesis, a new possibility that honors the wisdom in both opposing positions. Jung discovered that when highly sensitive people successfully engage the transcendent function, they often begin experiencing what he called symbol formation, spontaneous images, dreams, or insights that provide guidance for navigating psychological complexity. These symbols aren't random. They emerge from what Jung termed the autonomous psyche, the self-organizing intelligence that exists beyond conscious control. Jung believed this symbolic capacity was particularly active in sensitive individuals because their permeable psychological boundaries allow greater communication between conscious and unconscious processes. Jung taught patients to pay attention to recurring images, unexpected metaphors, or dreams that seem to address their psychological dilemmas. He saw these symbols as the psyche's natural guidance system for integration. For instance, a sensitive person struggling with boundary issues might dream of a house with windows that can open and close at will, a symbolic representation of conscious permeability. Another might repeatedly notice images of trees with both deep roots and flexible branches, symbols of grounded stability combined with adaptive responsiveness. Jung emphasized that these symbols shouldn't be interpreted intellectually, but allowed to work on you emotionally and imaginatively, gradually shifting your psychological orientation toward greater integration. Jung believed that the transcendent function in highly sensitive people served an evolutionary purpose for human consciousness as a whole. He theorized that as humanity faces increasingly complex challenges requiring nuanced responses, we need individuals capable of holding paradox without lapsing into oversimplification. Climate change, for example, requires us to hold urgency and patience, individual responsibility and systemic change, hope and realism simultaneously. Jung saw highly sensitive people as naturally equipped for this kind of complex thinking because their nervous systems are wired for subtlety rather than binary processing. But Jung emphasized that this evolutionary contribution only emerges through conscious development. Without integration, highly sensitive people become overwhelmed by complexity rather than capable of navigating it skillfully. Jung insisted that the transcendent function couldn't operate effectively without what he called shadow integration, consciously acknowledging and accepting the aspects of yourself that you've rejected or denied. For highly sensitive people, the shadow often contains qualities like appropriate selfishness, healthy aggression, and the capacity to disappoint others when necessary. Many sensitive individuals unconsciously reject these qualities, seeing them as incompatible with their caring nature. But Jung discovered that this rejection creates internal fragmentation that actually weakens the transcendent function. When you disown parts of yourself, you lose access to their wisdom and energy. Shadow integration doesn't mean acting on every impulse or abandoning your values. It means consciously acknowledging all aspects of your psychological reality so that the transcendent function can work with complete information rather than partial awareness. Jung's transcendent function isn't just a theoretical concept. It's a practical capacity that can be developed through conscious practice. When facing psychological complexity, instead of rushing toward resolution, You learn to maintain what Jung called creative tension until new possibilities emerge. This transforms the highly sensitive person from someone who's overwhelmed by life's complexity into someone who's uniquely equipped to navigate it with wisdom, creativity, and genuine helpfulness to others. Now that we've explored Jung's framework, let's examine how to recognize where you are in this developmental process. Jung believed that psychological growth happens in stages, and understanding your current stage allows you to focus your development efforts effectively. Stage 1. Unconscious absorption. If you're in this stage, you might notice that you leave social gatherings feeling drained or emotionally confused. You find yourself taking on the moods of people around you without realizing it's happening. You might feel responsible for other people's emotional states, or guilty when you can't fix someone's problems. Jung observed that people in this stage often experience what he called emotional contagion, automatically absorbing whatever psychological content they encounter. You might find yourself feeling sad after spending time with a depressed friend, anxious after being around worried family members, or angry after exposure to someone's frustration, even when these emotions don't connect to your own life circumstances. This isn't a character flaw. Jung recognized this as a natural starting point for sensitive individuals. Your nervous system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, gathering information about your psychological environment for survival purposes. The key indicator of this stage is confusion about emotional ownership. You feel intensely but struggle to identify which feelings actually originate from your own experiences versus what you've absorbed from others. Stage 2. Conscious recognition. In this developmental stage, you begin noticing patterns in your sensitivity. You might observe that certain people consistently leave you feeling depleted while others energize you. You start recognizing that your emotional state often correlates with your environment rather than your personal circumstances. Jung called this stage the awakening of psychological discrimination. You're developing what he termed observing ego, the part of your psyche that can step back and notice psychological phenomena rather than simply experiencing them. People in this stage often begin asking questions like, "Why do I feel this way after spending time with this person?" Or, "Is this anxiety actually mine, or am I picking up something from my environment?" Jung saw this questioning as crucial psychological development. You're beginning to differentiate between your authentic responses and absorbed material. However, people in this stage often struggle with what Jung called awareness without tools. You recognize what's happening, but lack effective techniques for managing it. Stage 3. Developing structure. This stage involves actively building what Jung called psychological containers. You begin experimenting with boundaries, learning to consciously engage and disengage your sensitivity based on choice rather than circumstance. Jung observed that people in this stage often go through what he called the boundary correction phase. After years of having no psychological boundaries, you might temporarily swing toward overprotection, becoming more guarded or withdrawn than feels authentic. This is a normal part of development. Jung recognized that most people need to experience their own psychological space before they can learn to share it consciously. You might notice yourself becoming more selective about social situations, requiring more alone time to process experiences, or feeling less obligated to manage other people's emotional states. Some friends or family members might react negatively to these changes, which Jung saw as confirmation that the boundaries were necessary. The key indicator of this stage is intentionality. You are making conscious choices about when and how to engage your sensitivity, rather than being at its mercy. Stage 4. Conscious application. Jung considered this the stage where sensitivity transforms from burden into gift. You've developed enough psychological structure to engage your perceptual abilities strategically. You can consciously choose to attune to specific psychological phenomena while filtering out others. People in this stage often report that they can sense underlying dynamics in groups or families, and use this information to facilitate understanding or healing. Your sensitivity becomes a tool for insight rather than a source of overwhelm. Jung observed that people in this stage naturally begin serving what he called therapeutic functions in their relationships and communities. Others feel genuinely helped by your presence because you can perceive and reflect back psychological patterns without absorbing them as personal burdens. You might notice that people spontaneously share deeper truths with you, that conflicts resolve more easily in your presence, or that groups naturally become more authentic when you're involved. Stage 5. Transcendent integration. Jung described this as the stage where opposites integrate into conscious wholeness. You've learned to hold paradox without psychological fragmentation. You can be simultaneously open and bounded, empathetic and self-protecting, helpful and autonomous. People who reach this stage often report a sense of psychological spaciousness. You can encounter intense emotional situations without being overwhelmed or disconnected. Your sensitivity serves consciousness rather than unconscious compulsion. Jung saw this stage as rare but achievable through dedicated inner work. The key indicator is what he called conscious choicelessness, responses that emerge naturally from integrated wisdom rather than effortful decision-making. Take a moment to reflect honestly on your own experience. Which of these descriptions resonates most strongly with your current psychological reality? Remember, Jung emphasized that growth isn't linear. You might recognize elements of multiple stages, or find yourself moving back and forth between different levels of development depending on circumstances. The goal isn't to rush toward the advanced stages, but to work consciously with whatever stage you're currently experiencing. Jung's revolutionary insight about highly sensitive people fundamentally challenges how we understand psychological development and human evolution itself. While most of psychology focuses on helping sensitive people adapt to a world that wasn't designed for their nervous systems, Jung proposed something far more radical: that highly sensitive people aren't adapting to the current world. They're preparing consciousness for the world we're becoming. The three-part framework we've explored today, building psychological structure, developing differentiated perception, and cultivating the transcendent function, isn't just personal development. It's preparation for what Jung called the next stage of human psychological evolution. Think about the challenges humanity faces today. Climate change requiring both urgency and patience, technology demanding both innovation and wisdom, global interconnection requiring both openness and discernment. These challenges can't be solved through simple binary thinking. They require exactly the kind of paradox holding, pattern recognizing, complexity navigating consciousness that properly developed highly sensitive people naturally possess. Jung believed that as these challenges intensify, the psychological capacities that currently make sensitive people feel different or difficult will become essential survival skills for humanity as a whole. But this evolutionary contribution doesn't happen automatically. It requires conscious development of what Jung called differentiated sensitivity, the transformation from unconscious absorption to conscious perception, from emotional overwhelm to psychological wisdom. If you recognize yourself in Jung's framework, remember that sensitivity without structure leads to overwhelm, but structure without sensitivity leads to disconnection. The goal isn't to eliminate your sensitivity or to become invulnerable. It's to develop what Jung called conscious permeability, the ability to open and close your psychological boundaries based on wisdom rather than circumstance. This development requires patience with yourself. Jung emphasized that psychological growth happens in layers, not leaps. Each stage builds on the previous one, and trying to skip stages often leads to psychological inflation or collapse. Most importantly, Jung insisted that this work can't be done in isolation. Highly sensitive people need what he called conscious community, relationships with others who understand the developmental process and can provide support without enabling unconscious patterns. Jung believed that every highly sensitive person who completes this developmental process contributes to what he called collective individuation, the gradual evolution of human consciousness toward greater complexity, wisdom, and integration. When you learn to hold paradox without fragmenting, you make it easier for others to develop this capacity. When you transform sensitivity from burden into wisdom, you demonstrate that it's possible. When you use your perceptual gifts to facilitate understanding rather than absorb dysfunction, you serve the evolution of consciousness itself. This isn't about becoming superior to others or claiming special status. Jung emphasized that psychological development serves wholeness, not ego inflation. The goal is to become more fully human, not more than human. Jung understood that individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, is a lifelong journey rather than a destination. There's no point where you've mastered sensitivity or completed your development. But there is a profound shift that happens when you begin working consciously with Jung's framework. Sensitivity stops feeling like something that happens to you and becomes something you consciously engage. Your psychological gifts stop being sources of overwhelm and become tools for understanding, healing, and wisdom. You begin to understand that your sensitivity isn't too much for this world. This world needs exactly the kind of consciousness you're capable of developing. I'm curious about your own experience with Jung's framework. Which of the 5 developmental stages resonated most strongly with your current psychological reality? Have you noticed patterns in how your sensitivity operates that you hadn't recognized before? And if you've been working consciously with your sensitivity for some time, what insights or techniques have you discovered that might help others who are earlier in this developmental process? Your experiences could provide exactly the perspective someone else needs to understand their own journey toward conscious sensitivity. The conversation about highly sensitive people and psychological evolution is just beginning. Your voice matters in shaping how we understand and develop these essential human capacities.